The chains rattled against the rotting floorboards like wind chimes made of despair. Samuel Hayes froze at the sound, his coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips. 3 years of solitude on this god-forsaken ranch, and he'd never heard anything like it coming from his own cellar. The sound came again, metal against wood, deliberate and weak. Samuel set down his mug, the coffee growing cold as quickly as his blood. His wife Sarah had been dead for 3 winters now, taken by fever, and he'd sealed that cellar the day they buried her. Too many memories lived down there among the preserves she'd canned, the quilts she'd sewn. He'd nailed those doors shut to keep the ghosts where they belonged. Yet something was down there now, something that breathed and moved and made the chains sing their broken song. He lit a lantern with trembling hands, the flame casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he approached the cellar entrance. The wood around the nails was splintered, torn away from the inside as if desperate fingers had clawed at freedom. The doors hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Samuel descended the stone steps, lantern held high, each footfall echoing in the damp space below. The smell hit him first, unwashed bodies, fear, and something else. Something that reminded him of the traveling wagons that passed through town, carrying cargo that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. In the far corner where Sarah's preserves once lined the shelves, a figure huddled against the wall, a girl maybe 16, with matted dark hair and clothes that had seen too many miles of hard travel. Heavy iron shackles bound her wrists and ankles, the chains long enough to allow movement, but short enough to ensure captivity. She looked up at his approach, and her eyes, Christ, her eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from watching hope die slowly. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath, "don't send me back to them." Samuel's lantern wavered. He opened his mouth to ask who them was, to demand how she'd gotten into his sealed cellar, to understand what nightmare had crawled into his carefully ordered world. Instead, she spoke again, and the words stopped his heart cold. "Sarah told me you were kind." The lantern nearly slipped from Samuel's grip. Sarah's name hung in the cellar air like smoke, impossible and real. He stared at the girl, searching her face for deception, for madness, for any explanation that didn't tear open wounds he'd spent 3 years learning to live with. "What did you say?" The girl shifted against the wall, chains scraping stone. "She came to me in dreams, said you'd help if I could just reach you." Her voice carried a strange accent, something that spoke of distant places and older languages. "Said to tell you about the garden behind the house, where she planted lavender for the bees." Samuel's blood turned to ice water. The lavender garden was Sarah's secret project, hidden behind the house where neighbors couldn't see. She'd died before the first blooms opened. He'd never told another soul about it. "Who are you?" "My name is Ayanna." She pronounced it like a song even through her exhaustion. "The men who took me, they said I was cargo now. Said I'd fetch a good price in California, working the mines or other places." Samuel understood. Human trafficking wasn't supposed to happen anymore, not since the war ended, but money had a way of making men forget about laws and decency. The girl was cargo to them, something to be bought, sold, used up and thrown away. "How did you get down here?" "I don't know." Tears tracked through the dirt on her cheeks. "I was chained in their wagon, praying to die, and then I was here, like something heard my prayers and brought me to the one place they told me about." Footsteps creaked across the floor above them. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd lived alone for 3 years. Those weren't his boots walking through his kitchen. "Henderson," a voice called from upstairs, rough, demanding, used to being obeyed. "We know you got property of ours down there." Girl ran off during the night, and her chains got dragged this direction. Samuel looked at Ayanna, saw the terror flood back into her eyes. She pressed herself deeper into the corner, chains rattling like broken prayers. "Send her up and we'll forget you was hiding stolen goods." The voice continued. "Keep her, and we'll have ourselves a problem." 3 years of grief had hollowed Samuel out, left him a ghost walking through his own life. But looking at this girl, seeing fear that reminded him of cornered animals and broken things, something stirred in the emptiness where his heart used to be. The choice carved itself clear as morning: send her back to a life worse than death, or stand between her and the kind of men who bought and sold human souls. Mr. Henderson, Ayanna whispered, using his name though he'd never given it. Sarah said you'd know what's right. Above them more footsteps. At least 3 men, maybe 4. Samuel climbed the cellar steps with the weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders like a millstone. Each boot fall on the wooden stairs sounded like a countdown to violence, and he could feel Ayanna's desperate eyes following him into whatever hell was waiting above. The kitchen door stood open, spilling autumn sunlight across men who wore trouble like a second skin. 4 of them, dressed in trail-worn clothes and carrying enough iron to start their own war. Their leader, a thick-built man with scars running down his left cheek like tears, leaned against Samuel's table as if he owned the place. Henderson, the scarred man, didn't bother with pleasantries. Name's Dalton. We tracked our property to your door, and we want it back. Samuel kept his hands visible, empty, non-threatening, but his mind was calculating distances, to the rifle above the fireplace, to the back door, to the cellar where an innocent girl waited for him to decide her fate. Don't know what you're talking about. Dalton smiled without humor. Girl named Ayanna, Indian blood, about 16 years old, worth considerable money to the right buyers. She broke loose during the night, and her drag marks lead straight to your property. Haven't seen any girl. That's disappointing to hear. Dalton nodded to one of his men, who started walking toward the cellar door. Because lying to me tends to make me irritable, and you don't want to see me irritable. Samuel stepped sideways, placing himself between the gunman and the cellar entrance. This is my land. You got no right to search it. Rights? Dalton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Friend, we're talking about recovering stolen property, worth more than your whole spread. Rights don't enter into it. The scarred man stood up from the table, his hand resting casual-like on his gun belt. Now we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Easy means you step aside, we collect what's ours, and ride out. Hard means we burn your house down and sift through the ashes for what remains. Samuel felt sweat gathering between his shoulder blades, despite the autumn chill. 4 guns against none. 4 men used to violence against one rancher who'd spent the last 3 years talking only to ghosts and cattle. The smart play was to step aside, let them take the girl, and go back to his coffee before it got completely cold. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, not from dreams or visions, but from their real conversations beside the fireplace during long winter nights. Samuel Hayes, you better never let me catch you walking past someone in need just because helping might cost you something. You're not taking her. The words surprised him as much as they surprised Dalton. 4 hands moved toward 4 guns, and Samuel realized he'd just signed his own death warrant. Well now, Dalton said softly, drawing his pistol with practiced ease. Looks like we're doing this the hard way after all. The moment stretched like pulled taffy. 4 guns trained on one unarmed rancher, who'd just made the worst decision of his life. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could smell the gun oil and unwashed bodies of men, who killed for money and slept sound afterward. Then Ayanna's voice drifted up from the cellar, soft and clear as church bells on Sunday morning. She was singing, not words Samuel recognized, but something older, something that spoke of wind across grasslands and stars that had watched over the world since before men learned to make chains. The melody wrapped around the tension in the kitchen like morning mist, and even Dalton's men shifted uncomfortably. Shut her up, Dalton growled, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Can't shut up a ghost song, one of his men muttered, and Samuel caught the fear threading through the words. She's not a ghost, Samuel said, though his own voice wavered. She's a 16-year-old girl who deserves better than what you're planning. Dalton's scarred face twisted with contempt. Deserves? She's Indian blood, Henderson, property that walked away from its rightful owners. Sentiment don't change the law. The singing stopped. Footsteps whispered up the cellar stairs, and Ayanna appeared in the doorway like something conjured from Samuel's deepest prayers and worst nightmares. The chains hung heavy from her wrists and ankles, but she stood straight-backed and proud, meeting Dalton's gaze without flinching. I am not property, she said. her voice carrying the strength of mountains. "I am Ayanna of the White River people, daughter of Chief Running Bear, and I will die before I let you sell me like cattle." "Little girl's got spirit," Dalton observed. "That'll bring a higher price." But Samuel was staring at something else, something that made his knees weak and his vision blur with tears he'd thought were all cried out. Around Ayanna's neck hung a small silver locket, tarnished with age and wear. Samuel knew that locket, had saved 3 months' wages to buy it for Sarah on their first wedding anniversary, had watched her touch it unconsciously whenever she was thinking hard about something, had buried it with her because he couldn't bear to look at something that held so much of her heart. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. Ayanna's hand moved to the locket, protective and gentle. "She gave it to me in the dream, said it would help you remember what love looks like." Dalton's impatience erupted into action. "Enough of this mystical horseshit. Boys, take the girl." But as his men moved forward, something remarkable happened. The autumn wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and doors, and carried with it the scent of lavender, impossible lavender, blooming 3 years out of season, filling the kitchen with the smell of Sarah's secret garden. The scent of lavender hit Dalton's men like a physical blow. The nearest gunman actually stumbled backward, his weapon wavering as he stared around the kitchen with wide, frightened eyes. Even Dalton himself looked unsettled, his scarred face pale beneath the grime of long travel. "What kind of trick is this?" he demanded, but his voice cracked like a boy's. Samuel felt something shift in the air around them, something that went beyond explanation or logic. The locket at Ayanna's throat caught the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with life of their own. "No trick," Samuel said, and found his voice steady for the first time since this nightmare began. "Just a woman who loved this place enough to leave something of herself behind." He stepped forward, placing himself between Ayanna and the 4 armed men who'd come to steal her freedom. "My wife Sarah died 3 winters ago, but she was the kindest soul who ever drew breath. If she's somehow watching over this girl, then I reckon that's all I need to know about what's right and what's wrong." "You're a damn fool, Henderson," Dalton snarled. 4 guns against 1 unarmed man. "Your noble gesture's going to get you killed and won't save her anyway." "Maybe." Samuel reached behind him, taking Ayanna's chained hand in his own. Her fingers were cold but strong, and he felt something pass between them. Courage, maybe, or just the simple recognition that some things were worth dying for. "But my Sarah always said a man's got to live with himself, and I'd rather die standing up than live on my knees." The lavender scent grew stronger, and now it was joined by other impossible fragrances: fresh baked bread, the soap Sarah used to make from lye and wildflowers, the particular smell of her hair after she'd washed it in rainwater. The kitchen filled with memories made manifest, and Dalton's men began backing toward the door. "Boss," one of them whispered, "this place is haunted. Let's cut our losses and ride." "She's worth too much to die for," the man interrupted, something Samuel had never heard anyone do to Dalton before. "That's Sarah Henderson's ghost we're smelling, and everyone knows what happens to men who cross the spirits of good women." Dalton looked around at his men, saw fear replacing greed in their eyes, and his shoulders sagged in defeat. "This isn't over, Henderson. There's other buyers, other opportunities. Girl like that's going to draw attention wherever she goes." "Then she won't be going anywhere," Samuel said quietly. "She'll stay here as family, under my protection." The scarred man stared at him for a long moment, then holstered his gun with violent frustration. "You're signing her death warrant, ours too maybe, but that's your choice to make." He jerked his head toward the door, and his men filed out like whipped dogs. A few minutes later, Samuel heard hoofbeats fading into the distance, carrying their particular brand of evil away from his doorstep. When the sound died completely, Samuel turned to Ayanna. "We need to get those chains off you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but tears of relief now rather than fear. "How did you know? How did you know she was really watching over me?" Samuel looked at the locket around her neck, at the impossible scent of lavender still lingering in his kitchen, at the way sunlight seemed to dance more brightly around this girl,
who'd somehow brought his dead wife's love back into his empty world. Because Sarah always kept her promises, he said simply. Even death couldn't change that about her. Years later, when Samuel was old and grey, and Ayanna had grown into a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom, he would still catch whiffs of lavender on autumn mornings. The garden behind the house had bloomed every year since that day, despite his never planting or tending it, and neighbors would come from miles around just to see the miracle of flowers that grew from love instead of soil. Ayanna became the daughter Sarah had always wanted, and Samuel the father she'd never had. They worked the ranch together, took in other lost souls when trouble found them, and built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate griefs. But on quiet evenings, when the wind was just right and the setting sun painted everything golden, Samuel would swear he could see Sarah sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, smiling at the family she'd somehow managed to create even from beyond the grave. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes each night was that silver locket, catching moonlight like captured stars, holding love that refused to die.